I grew up with the idea that the edges of safety were the things you could name: front door, porch light, my mother's key on the hook by the sink, small town rules. You left your bike unlocked sometimes. Neighbors borrowed sugar and returned it. The world felt contained by those ordinary objects until one night when the things that were supposed to protect me became the thin line holding back something that would not leave me alone. Before I tell you the stories, if you want more true accounts like this, stay until the end and consider liking and subscribing so I know to keep sharing. Now listen. The first time it happened, I was 12 and home alone while my parents went to a late dinner with friends. It was the kind of night that had already decided to be quiet. A low rain tapping on the windows, the hum of the PS2 in the living room, pizza boxes stacked on the counter because my mother had told me to order in for myself. I had the house to myself for the first time and felt a small electric sort of freedom. So I remember the silence as something almost luxurious. The doorbell sounded around 9. I paused the game. There are normal doorbells, and there are doorbells that slice through the air differently, and this one did. It had a rhythm like a question. I opened the peephole and saw a man in a plain jacket holding a pizza bag. He smiled in a way that didn't meet his eyes. "Delivery for Jessica?" he asked through the door. "That's me," I said, "because that's what you do." My voice had an edge to it I didn't like. He hesitated a beat too long. "You didn't order any extra wings, though." He looked over his shoulder like he was checking for someone else, and the porch light painted a strip of his cheek, so the left side of his face was a smear of shadow. Something in his posture made me rewind the scene in my head before it fully finished. I stepped back and lowered the bar. "My parents paid over the phone," I said, because it sounded adult enough. He lowered the pizza bag too, and then he asked the question that lodged there for months afterwards. "Are your parents coming home soon?" His voice was casual, but too interested. I remember thinking then that he wasn't just doing a job. I said they were, which was true, and he turned as if to leave. The problem wasn't him at the door. It was the way he stayed on the porch long after I pulled the chain shut, like he was listening through the wood. Later, I found out the pizza place had no record of an order at that time. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself a lot of things. An hour after they left, I went to the kitchen for water and glanced at the back sliding door. The glass was a dark square reflecting the room back at me. I could see the outline of myself in the living room, hunched, small, the TV light painting my face. Then someone tapped, softly, once, then twice, right against the glass. My breath stopped. It was a light, deliberate sound, like knuckles testing glass. I went to the phone with it in the corner of my eye, called my mom, and kept the handset pressed to my ear while I edged toward the bedroom and crawled under the covers like a child who still believed a blanket could stop everything. My mother's voice on the line was a calm island. "Call the police," she said. I called, my hands shaking so badly I had to press the phone between my shoulder and cheek to dial. The dispatcher told me to stay locked inside and keep quiet. It took nearly 20 minutes for a cruiser to arrive. 20 minutes is a long line of sounds when someone knows you are listening. The rain, the whine of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat, and the faint sound of the porch being prodded again. A rhythm that slid around the outside of the house like a cat's tail. When the police pulled up, their flashers painting the windows blue, the tapping stopped and the porch was empty. They took down my statement, walked the perimeter, and found damp footprints in the mulch leading to the side yard. Too big for me, too narrow for any of our neighbors' feet. I was told they would follow up. They never found anyone. I believed then that the driver and whoever tapped the glass were the same person, but I could only say I suspected it. My parents added a deadbolt to the back door the next day and sat with me for the rest of the night. I pretended not to replay the smile in the doorway. I still see it when I close my eyes, polite teeth and eyes that were checking exits, not faces. The thing about that night was not only that someone was outside, but how quickly the ordinary world turned strange and stayed that way. My room felt smaller. I slept with my phone under my pillow for years. I learned painfully that safety can be contingent and that contingency is a noise you carry. Years later, in my late teens, it started again. This time it was less a single event and more a steady weight. I had moved into my parents' old house while saving for college, and that house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. There was a small yard out front and a steep ditch behind the property that fed into a stand of trees. The neighborhood was the kind where late-night conversations filtered through open windows in summer. It was also the kind of place where I left music on low and worked on homework into the small hours. At first, it was nothing, a van idling 3 houses down that seemed to be there every couple of nights. Then I noticed a window light that wasn't ours across the street turn on and off at odd times, always aligning with when I stepped out to take out the trash. Once I looked out and saw a figure standing by the far edge of the street, hands in pockets, head down. When I froze on the stair, the figure lifted its head and watched, and I felt the prickle of eyes instead of the warmth of neighborhood. I found a scrap of paper on my porch one morning with a short, clumsy message, "Nice yard. No name, no return." I threw it in the trash like you do with junk mail, but kept thinking about its tone. Friendly enough to avoid immediate alarm, vague enough to imply persistence. I started double-locking the door at night, checking the back window before I went to bed. I told my roommates, who only shrugged and said we needed to call the cops if it got worse. It did. On a Tuesday, I was home studying when I heard something at the back of the house, a slow, rolling drag across the siding near the kitchen window. I crept to the window and saw a shadow moving outside, under the hedges, like someone crawling. The hedges made the sound thicken, leaves whispering, shoes on soil. I fumbled for my phone, called a friend who lived 2 doors down, and whispered, "Can you come?" He told me to hold on, and he came running with a baseball bat from his car. When we went outside together, the ground was crushed and there were prints near the shed. They led to the tree line and stopped. We called the police. They came. They took photographs. They said they would drive through the area more often. They recommended motion lights and alarm signs. The van was not seen that week. It returned the next. A pattern formed like tide marks, someone testing edges, watching to see how much noise we made before stepping closer. My roommates installed a bolt and an alarm sensor in the window. I slept with the light on for months. It wasn't all menacing scenes or late-night prowlers, though. There were afternoons with a neighborly wave and quiet barbecues where people laughed as if nothing had ever happened. The contrast made the persistence of being watched feel like a personal fracture. How could the same place hold both the familiar and the foreign? I began to suspect that the person wasn't always the same. Maybe different people. Maybe one who liked to be there when no one was. The police were practical and patient, but also frank. Without a face, without a name, without proof of harm, prevention becomes a suggestion and response a patrol. That ambiguity left me with an itch of mistrust I couldn't scratch away. The third time I was older, with friends, and I thought the woods back of the rental cabin would be a place to escape the small-town heaviness. We drove up for a weekend, no phones, a wood stove, cheap mattress springs, and the kind of silence that comes wrapped in acres of trees. The trip felt like a promise of reset. We laughed around a charcoal grill, played cards, and told stories until the cold turned the air into an object that could be felt. Night fell hard. The stars were bright enough to make us squint. Sometime after midnight, while most of us were on the porch with mugs, someone saw a light sweeping between the trunks down by the road. We assumed it was a passing car. Then the dogs barked, low and concentrated. The brush at the edge of the clearing shivered. A slow knock came on the cabin door. 3 soft hits. There was a pause. Another 3. The horsehair of silence rose on the back of my neck. We had rules among ourselves. No one opens the door to a stranger alone in the woods. My friend Mark went to the window and peered through a crack in the curtain. The face that looked back at him was a pale circle lit from below by a flashlight. It was close enough that you could make out the line of a jaw and something like a grin. He stepped back and slammed his hand against the sill so hard the curtain shook. "Who are you?" he called, voice steady in a way I envied. No answer. Instead, there was a scrape along the clapboard, like nails, and then the sound of something moving around the porch. We called the county sheriff. The phone had patchy service, so we left a message and hoped the signal would find a tower. In the meantime, we lighted every lantern, locked deadbolts, and stacked chairs under the windows. The person outside began to pound then, rough and angry, as if testing how long the wood would hold. One of the girls laid down on the floor in the hallway and started to pray under her breath, a short stream of names, a cadence that tried to anchor the room. I sat on the edge of the couch, pretending to be busy with a pack of cards, while my hands trembled so much the cards rattled. From the kitchen window, I could see a shadow move along the tree line and freeze like a weathered statue. Then the porch light flicked off, and the pounding stopped, as if someone had snapped their fingers. The quiet returned in fragments, the click of a lighter, distant tree branches scratching, our own breathing. We heard the crunch of gravel before we saw headlights. A deputy's car rolled up slow, blue lights tiny but miraculous in the dark. Whoever was outside melted into the trees. The deputy stayed long enough to take a report and to shine a beam into the woods that showed only the same trunks and darkness, nothing else. He told us people liked to hunt cabins at night, curiosity seekers he called them, and suggested we leave in the morning if we didn't feel safe. We did. The thing about the cabin was not the missing face or the pounding, but the way my friends and I walked out with our effects and luggage and kept glancing back as if something might be following in our rearview mirror. We drove away with the heater on so loud I couldn't hear my own thoughts. For weeks afterwards, any sudden knock at a door made me flinch, and I found myself standing at windows in apartments and houses I've lived in since, hands pressed to glass, staring back into the night. The final story I want to tell from those years is quieter, but it stayed with me because it was closer to the shape of home. Late winter, a house half empty because my parents had started the process of moving. I was subletting the place for a month before college, and the house felt like a hollowed-out version of itself. Nothing had the right place. The heating system thunked like a tired animal. It began with a call at 3 in the morning, a sound that made me sit bolt up in bed. The number was blocked. I answered on instinct. A voice whispered so low I could barely make out the syllables. It wasn't a recorded call or a wrong number. It was someone breathing with a rhythm that sounded practiced. "Are you awake?" the voice asked. It wasn't a question so much as an observation. My throat closed. I told him to stop calling. The breath did not belong to anyone I knew. I walked to the front window. The porch light, which I had forgotten to turn off, painted the driveway in an orange smear. There was a parked car where there hadn't been one when I left for work 2 days before. A person sat there, head bent forward, like they were fiddling with something inside. I watched with my phone clutched to my ear until the line went dead. I called 911 and gave them the plate number. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and described the car as checked and unoccupied by patrol. They said they'd send a unit. My chest felt like a fist. As the minutes stacked, so did noises. A slow scrape along the side of the house, a distant shift of gravel, the car door closing somewhere behind the tree line. I crept down the hall, each step measured, and stopped at the kitchen doorway. From the back of the house came a soft, repeating sound, tapping 3 times, like someone testing whether something brittle would give. My mouth tasted of copper. I could hear my neighbor's television through the thin wall, a comedy laugh track that seemed obscene against the raw edges of the night. I thought of opening the porch, back door, and running to a neighbor's, of stepping outside into the brightness and confronting whatever was there. But the practical voice I'd been cultivating since that first pizza incident said to do the opposite. Stay inside, keep quiet, wait for help. So I sat on the kitchen floor in the dark and tried to breathe like a person who had rehearsed for crisis. When the deputy finally knocked on my door, I came to the safety of light like someone surfacing. They reported seeing a vehicle parked 10 houses down with a man sitting inside. He left before they could identify him. There was no sign of forced entry. The deputy said to be careful. I thanked him and closed the door and locked it twice. I don't tell these stories to thrill you. I tell them because they rewrote how I move through quiet places. Each night after any of those incidents, I would sit with the house lit and feel the presence of waiting. I couldn't sleep without checking windows 3 times. I flinched at the sound of a car door. I learned to make a phone call loudly and steadily in front of whoever might be listening, to speak as if someone else were in the room with me, even when I was not. People often ask what changed me in the long run. It's not that I stopped going out. It's that the margin of safety became smaller, edged with a constant awareness. I learned to treat doors and blinds like instruments of survival. I learned to keep a record of plates. I learned that even when police arrive and take notes, closure is rarely neat. There were no arrests that tied every loose end. There were instead a series of deterrences: lights, bolts, the occasional flashlight beam, neighbors who no longer felt like strangers. Even now, years later, on a quiet night when the wind hits the trees just right, I catch myself listening at the glass the way I used to. The tapping motif repeats in my head, not like a memory, but like a warning that lives just beneath the skin. I have a permanent list of measures I take when I feel watched, and I pass them on when friends uncomfortably laugh and say, "You worry too much." Maybe I do, or maybe worry is just practice. Tonight, after telling you this, I checked the locks twice. When I went to the kitchen, there was a faint sound from downstairs, soft, discreet, like boots on laminate. My breath caught. I pressed my back to the wall and listened. The sound came again, a measured step. It was close. I couldn't tell if it was the building settling or something more deliberate. I reached for my phone on the counter, thumb hovering above the emergency call button. The silence stretched. Then, from somewhere right outside the living room window, there was a soft, patient tapping. Slow, 3 taps, like someone checking whether the house. The 3 taps sounded again, patient and deliberate, right beneath the living room window. They were close enough now that the reverberation traveled through the glass into my teeth. My throat tightened until my breath felt like a borrowed thing. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether my ears had invented the sound to confirm my dread. "Stay where you are," the dispatcher said when I finally found my voice. "Units are en route. Any description of the person?" I swallowed. I think he's outside the living room window. Dark jacket, hat, sitting, tapping." My hands trembled against the phone. The room had become a theater of small, precise noises: the hiss of the fridge in the other room, the house settling, the neighbor's distant television laugh track still bleeding through the wall in grotesque timing with my pulse. "Keep the line open," she said. There was a practiced calm in her voice that began to stitch me back to the present. "Are you able to see a face?" "No," I said, "just a shape. He's close." The tapping resumed. 3 knocks, as if someone were counting me out in a slow, mechanical lullaby. I moved to the blinds, the old habit of peeking through a hairline slit, like some animal trying to gauge a shadow. The glass was cooler than I'd expected. The porch light smeared the man into a dark rectangle. His face was a suggestion under the hood of his jacket. He did not move suddenly or with panic. He moved like someone who had rehearsed being still. "Sir, if you are outside that house, leave now," I said aloud. The steadiness felt borrowed too, like an article of clothing slipped on in a hurry. But it worked. My mouth formed the words the way I'd practiced in the aftermath of other nights. There was a pause. Then a voice answered, low and quiet, not loud enough for me to make out words at first, more a rasp of air against the screen. When it resolved into language, it did something worse than threaten. It remembered. "You used to leave the porch light on," it said. "You used to talk to the mailman." My scalp prickled. The voice had a familiarity that slid along the edges of memory without committing. I thought of the first pizza incident, how small gestures had given whatever this was a purchase. Had I waved once at a stranger and that had been enough? Had a neighbor in the dark received an invitation by mistake? "What do you want?" I asked. The words felt small. He tapped once, then twice, then 3 times. The pattern felt like punctuation. "You worry too much," he said, and there was no malice in the tone, just a quiet assessment, like someone explaining why an animal trembles. "You make a list." Heat rose in my face. The list, the plates, the neighbors' names, the things I'd started carrying in my pockets like talismans, felt obscene to have been inspected. "I'm calling the police," I said. "Leave, now." The man shifted. The fabric of his jacket whispered. The tapping stopped. From somewhere down the street, a dog barked, a single staccato note that made the man startle like a person reminded of their body. When the sound broke, the man moved away from the window and toward the shadowed edge of the porch. My heart beat against the ribs like an alarm. I had rehearsed these movements so many times that in another life they would have been muscle memory. Stand where you can see the door. Do not run to the entry. Make noise if needed. Have a plan for escape. I had told myself I would be prepared for when the unknown became known. They arrived faster than I expected. Headlights painted long bars across the blinds. Red and blue reflections lanced across the ceiling and through the curtains like fish scales. The sound of tires crunching on gravel magnified my chest as precisely as any blow. A car door slammed. Voices outside, 2 sets at first, then the measured clack of boots on the walkway. Someone called out, then another voice, a man's voice this time, clear and official. "Police, miss, are you okay in there?" I moved toward the door because I had to, because the instinct to be present when someone arrived was lodged somewhere beneath my fear. I opened the front door a crack and let out a beam of light. The deputy's face appeared in the doorway, soft with concern, hard with the conditional violence of authority. He scanned the yard, the porch, the street. "We saw a parked car," he said. "You called it in?" "Yes," I said. He was right there." I pointed to the window. "He was tapping on the glass." The deputy looked where I'd pointed, then down at the porch. "We checked 10 houses down," he said. "No one in the car now. I can't find a sign of entry. Did you lock your doors?" "Yes." I realized I was reciting the checklist. Locks, plates, neighbors, lights. It came out like prayer. He leaned his shoulder against the frame. "Do you want us to look around the yard?" "Please." My voice nearly broke. He nodded and called to his partner. They split, systematic and calm, sweeping the lawn with flashlights. The beam's movement revealed nothing. The potted fern, the sagging welcome mat, a garden gnome tipped on its side, as if someone had bumped it and kept walking. The deputy's lights passed over the mulch and the neat bed of hostas and found nothing to fix onto. One of them moved to the gate and lifted it carefully. There were faint prints in the mulch, soft impressions of sneaker tread, altered by the wind and time into something ambiguous. The deputy crouched and held his light close. "Looks fresh," he said under his breath, more to his partner than to me. "Could from tonight." I watched with a cold clarity I remember from other nights, the way a situation compresses the options into a narrow tunnel. If he had left something, it might be there. If he wanted me to find it, he would have left a mark. My hands moved without permission, stepping to the side door to peek at the back porch. There, on the edge of the back step where the light from the neighbor's house pooled, something small lay half hidden. Bright plastic, chipped paint, an object I hadn't expected to be there. Not in my yard, not after all this. "What's that?" I asked. A deputy walked over and picked it up with a gloved hand. It was a little wind-up frog toy, the kind with a key in its back that, when wound, rocked forward and made a tinny chirp. Someone had pried the key off and set it in the mud like a fossil. The paint on its back had been scratched 3 small parallel lines. My hands went suddenly numb. The toy's cheap smile looked obscene in the porch light. "He left this?" I asked. The deputy held it up. "No prints worth mentioning," he said. "No ID, but whoever left it wanted you to find it." He turned it over. The scratches, probably a message or a habit. It's the tapping, I said before I could stop myself. 3 taps, like this. My fingers tapped on the doorframe in a rhythm that felt ridiculous and necessary all at once. He nodded, the corners of his mouth tight. "We can file this as stalking," he said. "It's not uncommon. We'll canvass again, take statements, look for cameras. Do you have any outside cameras?" No. The word was smaller than I felt. For years, I'd relied on light and doors and my own body to be the barrier. Cameras felt like an escalation I had not allowed myself. "I don't want this filmed," I added, because I didn't know whether that was true or whether I was scared of making it more real. "You did the right thing calling," he said. "We'll increase patrols tonight. You should stay with a neighbor if you're able, or we can have an officer stay inside while we do a sweep near your property." His eyebrows drew together. It helps people feel safer. There is dignity in the ways we choose to refuse fear. I had learned to run my life at the edges of it, but I did not want someone else's presence in my living room, even in uniform, to become the new normal. "No," I said. "I can manage. I looked at the toy in his hand. I'll be fine." He looked at me, and for a second I saw something in his expression that resembled pity and something that resembled envy. Envy for someone who could still choose to stay. "We'll leave this with you for now. If he comes back, call us immediately." They left. The toy on my kitchen table, like an offering. It sat there under the sharp yellow light, a domestic abomination, bright green plastic, and a grin that refused context. When I touched it, the tininess of the mechanism scraped my palm. If I wound it, would it move? Would it break the spell by being what it was, child's play? Or would winding it be an invitation? I didn't wind it. Instead, I carried it to the sink and held it under the faucet until the water ran green and the dirt loosened. The scratches along its back did not fade. They felt like the memory of someone else's fingers. For the rest of the night, I kept the lights on. I made a list: plates, faces, times, scribbled in a half-legible block on the back of an old envelope. I called a neighbor and then another, and their voices on the other end were kind and practical. They agreed to check their security lights and walk their yards. The house felt larger and smaller at once. Larger because other people inhabited it now by proxy. Smaller because the toy sat on the table and the rhythm of 3 taps had found a place inside my bones. Sometime late, long after the deputies had driven away and the sirens had dissolved into the distance, I heard a noise again. Not outside this time, but from the hallway. Soft, deliberate steps. For a breath, I thought it might be the house, settling into sleep. Then, at the far end of the hall, my bedroom door shifted the slightest fraction. My throat went dry. I reached for the phone, thumb brushing the emergency call on the lock screen. For years, I'd rehearsed the lines. For years, I'd told myself I'd never flinch. I moved into the doorway, and the sound stopped. Then, from the living room table, where the frog sat under the lamp, came a noise so faint I almost didn't hear it. A metal click, like the sound of winding. The toy had not been wound. I had not touched it. The small key, inexplicably, turned once and then fell silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, in the precise rhythm that had become a brand in my nights, 3 soft, patient taps came from the kitchen table. 3 taps on the cheap plastic back of a child's toy. I felt the list in my pocket, the names and plates folded paper stiff, and knew what being watched had taught me, that sometimes the thing that wants you will not be outside at all. It will learn to make itself at home. I did not move to pick up the toy. My hands folded over one another, an anchor against the small panic. Outside, a neighbor left a light on, its beam sweeping the street in a lazy promise. Inside, the tapping continued, metronomic and calm, and the house listened like it had always been waiting for another sound to remember. I dialed 911 again. My fingers did not shake this time. They obeyed. The operator answered, and I said clearly, "He's in the house." The words hit the ceiling and hung there. The line hummed with the urgency of voices becoming a plan. Through the house, something moved, a breath, an imprint of motion in the air. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a patient thing, like someone folding their hands and waiting for me to decide. I thought of all the measures I'd learned, the bolts, the list, the practice of speaking loud, and realized they were no longer enough on their own. Some margins of safety close down until the only option left is to change the shape of your life. I backed away from the table, from the toy, and into the hallway where my back met the wall. The phone in my hand was steady. I'd memorized routes, practiced whispering instructions, kept the spare keys in the same place. I counted each step, not to pace my fear, but to make it something measurable. Just as the dispatcher said they were dispatching units, the front door burst open and light poured into the living room like a blade. Voices shouted names I didn't know, and the word clear traveled like an order. Boots stomped in, 2 pairs at first, then more, the officers moving through the rooms with the businesslike speed of people trained to remove what does harm. They swept the house with flashlights and sounds and the smell of other people's breath and leather. They found no one. They found the front door unlocked as if by habit. They found the back gate slightly ajar. They found no prints on the toy. One of the deputies picked up the little frog and wound it with a professional curiosity, and the toy chirped a tiny mechanical sound that was almost ridiculous. "Looks like someone wanted to scare you," the deputy said, and for a second his face softened into something like sympathy and something like fatigue. "Why leave this behind?" I asked. The question tasted like a dare. He shrugged. "Sometimes that's all they need. Sometimes it makes them feel like they still have power." He set the toy down on the counter and tapped it once as if testing its weight. "We'll file the report. We'll keep an eye on the area tonight." They collected statements in careful, efficient paragraphs. They took the toy as evidence. They made notes on their pads that would live in a stack somewhere between routine and report. When the deputies left, they promised increased patrols and quieter reassurances. After they were gone, the house felt different, less like a shield and more like a skin. The light they left on in the hallway made long shadows along the floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table until the yellow bulb hummed low and the edge of my vision blurred. At 3 a.m, I woke to sunlight on the blinds, a neighbor's truck idling by the curb, and the noise of life resuming outside like a thing that had never stopped. The frog was gone from the counter, but the curve of its small brin had been burned into my memory. I made coffee in a mechanical way and sipped it like someone practicing peace. The list remained on the table. I folded it in my hands the way people fold prayers. There were names and numbers and plate sightings and a series of times that traced a week of small intrusions. I knew, in a weary clarity, that this was not likely to be a single night. Someone had learned how I slept, how I left lights on, how I spoke loudly to chase away shadows. The house knew that someone had practiced too. I walked through the rooms in the daylight and closed the curtains with the deliberate motion of someone setting boundaries. The porch light still glared the same orange smear onto the driveway. The welcome mat waited like a placard. In the corner of the yard, the mulch was disturbed, and there was a faint impression where a shoe had been. I knelt and looked closer. A small key, half buried in the dirt, its metal tarnished but familiar in shape. I picked it up. It was the toy's key. It had been placed where I would find it only after the deputies had left, only after I thought the night had exhausted itself. I held the key and felt the residual warmth of the ground. Someone had come back in the dark to leave me a note in plastic and metal. I sat on the front step with the key in my palm and thought about the list I'd made and the measures I had learned. For the first time since the first knock on the door, I allowed myself to consider not how to survive one night, but how to change the terms of living altogether. Fear could be practiced, safety could be too, but they required different things. Cameras, neighbors you trusted enough to let your life spill into theirs, routines you shared rather than hid. The tapping had stopped for now. The man, whoever he was, had reached into my life and left a toy and a key like a punctuation mark. It could have been a random act of cruelty. It could have been rehearsal. What mattered was the direction of the line he had drawn toward me. I folded the key into my palm and let it cool. In the small quiet that followed, my mind began to make a plan that was not only about locks and lists, but about not letting the margin of my life be defined by a stranger's curiosity. I stood, pocketed the key, and walked back inside. The house felt like an instrument you tuned by hand, lights, bolts, voices. I turned the deadbolt twice and left the porch light on, then opened my phone to the contacts list and scrolled to the name of the neighbor who had offered to stay if things got worse. When I called, his voice was still drowsy but steady. "I can stay," he said before I could finish, "or my sister said she could." I paused, surprised by the suddenness of the offer, by the fact that his willingness required no rehearsal. "Thank you," I said. I think I'd like that." He asked if I wanted him to come over now. I looked at the small key in my hand and at the empty space where the toy had been. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees and something, somewhere, mailbox, trash can, the empty road, made a sound like a tiny knock. "Yes," I said, "now please." I tucked the key into my pocket and waited for a human presence that would not be practiced but chosen. The house around me loosened by degrees as I prepared to let someone else in the margins of my life. Whatever the man outside had wanted, he had reminded me that I could change the terms of my days. When my neighbor arrived, I opened the door and let him in. The light from the porch washed over his face. He carried a thermos and a soft, patient look. We sat at the kitchen table and talked in low voices about trivial things until the conversation orbited the night. About the toy, about the keys, about whether we should move the locks or get cameras, and then about me, about how I'd been moving through quiet places for a long time. He didn't offer heroics. He made coffee and kept watch like someone who had decided to share a life for a few hours. The police promised patrols, and I promised a call if anything else happened. The neighbor's presence was not a permanent solution, but it was a different margin of safety, companionship. I slept in the living room with the lamp on and a blanket pulled to my chin. When I finally dropped into the shallow sleep that comes after a long night, there was a last thin impression in the dark, the odd sensation that the house had kept the tapping and was now collecting it, folding it into its walls like a story. In the morning, the key was on the counter where I'd left it. The deputies left a follow-up card in my mailbox. I called the number on the card twice before I finally reached someone. They promised to increase patrols for the week and to check records for similar incidents. That afternoon, I took the key to the police station. They logged it as evidence and told me to keep the case file number. The woman at the desk smiled with professional compassion and said, "We'll do what we can." She said it the way people say things that are true and limited both. I left the key and walked back into sunlight. At home, I found, "If you want to talk, we're here. R." It was the simple tether I had needed. I wrote back that afternoon, my handwriting steadier than it had been the night before. I told R, "Thank you." I told him I'd keep the porch light on. Days passed and the tapping did not return. The officers' cars drove by more often. I bought a camera that I mounted to the eaves like a small blinking eye. I set the porch light on a timer. I started to sleep with an extra key under the mat, the way people with histories often create redundant safeties. I practiced saying the loud sentences I would say if the night returned. And yet, there was a change in me that no list could erase. The house no longer felt like a sealed thing. It had edges that could be breached. There was a plastic grin somewhere in the catalog of my memory that would not go away. Once, when the wind hit the trees just right and made a sound against the siding, I felt the old tightening, And then, because of the neighbor's note and because of the deputy's cautious insistence, I exhaled in a new shape. Careful, deliberate, refusing to be smaller than my house. Weeks later, when I collected my case files at the station, the detective handed me a photograph. A shadowed image from a camera 2 miles away, showing a man in a dark jacket by another house at about the same time we'd called it in. He had been watching then, too. The photo was grainy, but the outline of a hood was unmistakable. The detective said they were running it for matches. I kept the photograph folded in my desk drawer. I left the porch light on most nights. I learned to name the difference between practice and life. Practice is the scaffolding you build when you know there's no immediate answer. Life is what you choose after the scaffolding is up. I started saying yes to friends who wanted to come over for coffee in the afternoon. I refused invites to places that felt like risk without reason. I learned to be visible in small, safe ways. Still, on some nights when the house was quiet and the trees scraped like fingernails, I would stand at the window and listen. My palms would remember the weight of the key in my pocket. My fingers would replay the rhythm of 3 taps. I had built more margin, yes, but the tapping had taught me a more difficult lesson. Fear could be cataloged, policed, and sometimes even chased away. But the act of being watched was a human thing that outlived any one night. One evening, months after the frog had gone and the prince had faded, there came a knock at the door. It was a polite, single knock, not the tapping I'd come to dread, but a different sound altogether. I opened the door with my hand on the deadbolt and found no one on the porch. There was, instead, a small package on the welcome mat, brown paper, no address, no note. I picked it up. Inside was a single key, identical to the one I'd found months earlier. I looked down the street. The houses stood silent and ordinary. The package was cool in my hand. The margin of safety I'd been building felt, at that moment, both fragile and necessary. I set the key on the table and sat for a long time, considering it like a question. Then, slowly, I reached for my phone and called R, the neighbor with the thermos and the quiet, patient help. "Do you want to come over?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there in 5. I waited with the key in my palm, and when he arrived, we sat at the kitchen table and talked about locks and cameras and the ridiculousness of plastic frogs. He added a chain of his own to the lock on my door, small and practical, and together we wound the new key into the drawer where I kept backups and always had a list. That night, the house was not the same as it had been before the tapping, but it was also not the small, sealed world it had been while I counted plates and learned to speak loud. It was a house where neighbors checked in, where deputies logged reports, where a photograph in a drawer might someday mean something decisive. At 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of a car driving by, and, for a beat, to the habitual tightening in my chest. Then I remembered the key on the table, and the neighbor's knock, and the way we had decided to face the problem together. I sat up and looked out the window. The street was empty and ordinary. The porch light smeared the pavement orange. The night air moved the trees. My hand found the list in the drawer and smoothed it flat. And somewhere, far enough away that it felt like memory rather than threat, there was the echo of 3 soft taps, no longer on my window, but perhaps the recollection of them settled into the walls like an old clock. I let the sound live there and did not let it decide the shape of my days. When morning came, I made coffee and called the detective and left a message about the new key. The world resumed its slow business of being kind and ordinary until it wasn't, and in the space between those 2 facts, I learned to walk forward with more companions than I'd had before. I had been taught painfully that margins could change. I had also learned that safety was not an absence of fear, but the presence of things that made fear manageable. Lights, locks, friends, a police car on a street at night. The tapping had given me a new vocabulary for how to live. Measures, yes, but also the choice to not let someone else's attention become the author of my life. And so I live with the knowledge that sometimes the world presses close and draws a line in the sand, and other times it lets you step beyond it. I keep the porch light on. I keep a list. I keep a neighbor's key and a deputized kindness in my phone. I sleep in the light more nights than not. If he comes back, I will be ready in new ways. If he does not, the margin of my life will have widened in small increments. Neighbors who come over with a thermos, a detective's photograph in a drawer, a camera in the eaves. The tapping will not own me. But on certain nights, when the wind is steady and the house is listening, I still press my ear to the glass and let the memory of 3 measured taps remind me of the work of reclaiming the spaces that fear would take. I do not tell these stories to frighten. I tell them because they change the way I move through quiet places, and because sometimes, in the middle of the night, a plastic frog and a forgotten key are the small languages that let you know you are not alone.